Great, thank you. I too want to thank Cosmin and Xinyi and the wonderful staff at Parasite, first for the invitation to speak here, but also for the tremendous hospitality that they've shown us while we're here. I'm thrilled to be in Hong Kong for the first time and sad that I have to leave for the first time. I purposely chose a poetic title so that I would have some flexibility in deciding what I would like to present today. Nevertheless, I've changed it. So the new title is Then Maybe I'm Fabulous Too: Gossip and Queer Knowledge Production. What I'd like to do is present work from a book that I'm currently completing on the role of gossip in North American queer film culture. The book, tentatively titled A Gossip of Images, Hollywood Star Images, and Queer Counterpublics, is an attempt to theorize the dynamic process of speculating about and embellishing Hollywood star images in queer counterpublics as a form of gossip. To make this argument, I analyze select examples of films, videos, performances, literature, and criticism, as well as the incidental and indiscreet remark in an interview or at a conference, like this one. Gossip, I argue, is not simply a means of oral communication, but a speculative logic of thought, apposite to cinema, and central to the construction of identity and intimacy in queer counterpublics. Following the work of literary scholars Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick and Patricia Meyer-Spaks, I treat gossip as a performative means of transforming one's relationship to the self and one's intimates through the circulation of speculations about others. And in this sense, I'm thrilled that my presentation comes after Petra's, because when she asked us to say what we heard, I heard gossip. I heard the women gossiping. It's maybe my own perversity. Moreover, I take seriously the etymological link of the word speculation to the Latin specula, meaning lookout and watchtower, and speciere, to see and look, so as to emphasize the possibilities visualized through the intimate exchange of conjecture about others. I suggest that the speculative function of gossip is to enhance, embellish, and expand images of others, be they personal acquaintances or Hollywood stars, so as to generate unique images that are gossip's own. Hence, I coined the term gossip image. Although the book certainly has historical implications, its main concern is in providing a theorization of gossip as a mode of image circulation, so as to clarify the productivity of a queer investment in Hollywood star images. My examples from the history of predominantly US-American queer filmmaking and film criticism focus roughly on the period dating from the underground film movement in the 1960s through the birth of the so-called new queer cinema of the 1990s. I've organized the book according to different aspects of a theory of gossip: circulation, belief, details, and fabulation. And I was going to present today work from my chapter on belief, in which I position belief as the epistemological arrangement of gossip. It's a chapter that focuses on the underground scene around artist, filmmaker, and performer Jack Smith in New York in the 1960s, about whom I've done a lot of curating and writing. However, I've decided instead, in the spirit of almost every other presenter, to focus on something else than what was advertised, namely on the issue of circulation, in which I explain how I came to be interested in the theoretical possibilities of gossip. The historical context that I describe is closely related to that queer, artistic, and activist context of New York City in the 1980s and early 90s, as described by Greg Bordowitz in his 1993 essay, My Postmodernism. The critical postmodernism that Bordowitz offers us fostered scores of US artists. Among them, we could list Bordowitz himself, of course, Zoe Leonard, Andrea Fraser, Tom Kalin, Tom Burr, Glenn Ligon, and perhaps later also Sharon Hayes, who was mentioned here, among many others. These are all artists who engage in a broad-ranging and ongoing investigation of avant-garde concerns with language, authorship, image politics, art as institution, democratic public space, historical memory, and the problematization of subjectivity in ethical and political terms. I won't be discussing any of these artists today, but I hope in what I do discuss to indicate one conceptual, critical, and in some cases formal strategy employed by some of them in their work, namely that of gossip. So I think if one were to check off a list of terms in art vocabulary that my presentation is meant to challenge or recalibrate, one could nick the boxes for, among others, postmodernism, camp, appropriation, gossip, of course, in as much as it is a term in contemporary art vocabulary, and queer. The Secret Lives of Images. Marlene Dietrich in a tuxedo kissing a woman in Morocco. Greta Garbo in male attire kissing her lady-in-waiting in Queen Christina. Katharine Hepburn in boy drag in Sylvia Scarlett. John Ireland and Montgomery Clift comparing guns in Red River. Sal Mineo watching James Dean enter the bathroom in Rebel Without a Cause. These are just some of the classic cinematic images that have circulated for years in US and European gay and lesbian culture. As the film scholar Judith Main notes in her seminal work on the feminist and lesbian resonances of the image of Hollywood director Dorothy Arzner, quote, "Some cinematic images have been cited and reproduced so frequently in the context of gay and lesbian culture that they have almost acquired lives of their own." End quote. Such images, Main writes, achieve their autonomy only through a convenient forgetfulness, or, quote, bracketing of what happens to these images, plot and narrative-wise, in the films in which they appear, where heterosexual symmetry is usually restored with a vengeance, end quote. But, I would say, there are some of us who do not have to forget or bracket them, for we have never seen the films in which they originally appeared. That is, many of us have come to know such images only through their circulation in gay and lesbian culture, through their contextualization in found footage films, in clip show presentations at queer film festivals, in queer criticism, on YouTube, or in presentations like this one. I initially became familiar with some of these star images and many others like them in the late 1980s and early 90s, during the intense period of AIDS and queer activism and burgeoning queer theory in the United States. This was also a time of a great increase in the critical recirculation of images from popular culture, a time when numerous activist videos and gay and lesbian film festival clip shows subjected media images of all kinds to critique and appropriation, a time when theories of postmodern parody and post-structuralist gender subversion flourished, a time, finally, when cultural analysis and cultural activism, to invoke the subtitle of the seminal 1987 AIDS issue of the academic art theory journal October, a time, finally, when cultural analysis and cultural activism contributed substantially to the development of a queer counterpublic. And this, you see, is my dog-eared copy of that art journal that many of us stopped reading about 20 years ago. For many of us who came of age politically, intellectually, culturally, and sexually at this time, a sense of ourselves as queer was linked to this counterpublic's recirculation of images from popular culture. I first encountered many of these classic Hollywood images then, not only by watching classic Hollywood films, but also, and sometimes solely, by participating in this exciting new queer culture. One cannot underestimate the extent to which AIDS activism and the cultural theory that was produced in conjunction with it contributed to the political and theoretical education of a whole generation of young queers. In the AIDS issue of October, for example, we learned the life-saving lesson that gay male promiscuity was not the source of our problems, but was instead part of the solution. Gay male promiscuity, Douglas Crimp argued, not only provided practical experience of a variety of sexual pleasures, but also facilitated the construction of an intimate network of lovers and confidants that could be utilized for the quick transmission of information about safer sex, as well as for the frequent application and refinement of it. "It is our promiscuity that will save us," wrote Crimp in an essay that challenged then prevalent media representations of promiscuous gay men as murderously irresponsible. In this context, AIDS activism extended beyond street demonstrations to include analysis, critique, and appropriation of mainstream media representations that not only blindly reflected ignorance about our sexual practices, but also contributed to a homophobic and racist climate. We came to understand that AIDS was not only a disease syndrome diagnosed by scientists and doctors and responsible for thousands of deaths. It was also, as Paula Treichler put it in her contribution to October, an epidemic of signification. Coming of age as a young queer intellectual in the context of AIDS activism meant developing a sophisticated understanding of representational practices and of the dynamics of and necessity for counter-information and counter-public representations. Indeed, the starting point for the journal's issue was Crimp's assertion that AIDS did not exist as a scientific fact set aside from the scholarly concerns of art and cultural theory, but that it was constructed and conceptualized through discursive and representational practices. He noted, quote, "If we recognize that AIDS exists only in and through these constructions, then the hope is that we can also recognize the imperative to know them, analyze them, and wrest control of them," end quote. In the late 80s and early 90s then, our sexual practices and our cultural analyses, our activism and our theory and art making brought us together as a queer counterpublic in the face of a hostile and threatening public. Wresting control of the constructions of AIDS involved the resignification of words and phrases and the redirection and reinflection of a vast array of news, advertising, and film images. Alongside lectures, essays, books, posters, and demonstrations, film and video played an important role in this massive counter-public recirculation of images. AIDS activists, film and video documented demonstrations, publicized the work of the movement, countered false and homophobic news reporting, and mourned the loss of lovers and friends. In the process, this work carved out a space for queer desire and resistance. That in the midst of such a flurry of images and counter-images, classic Hollywood star images would also be subjected to critical analysis and wrested from the control of their typically heteronormative narrative constraints was evident, at least since 1985, when movie star Rock Hudson announced that he had AIDS. Hudson's AIDS confession and later death shocked the public and the mainstream media into an awareness not only of the tragedy of the disease, but also of the reality of Hudson's homosexuality. As a result, as art historian Richard Meyer has usefully pointed out, mainstream journalists scoured Hudson's cinematic and private life to legitimate their sense of the star and the man's betrayal, for providing them with decades' worth of respectable images of heterosexual masculinity. In a telling, and for the period perhaps emblematic statement, the then New York Times drama critic Frank Rich wrote, and I quote here at length, "Does Hudson's skill at playing a heterosexual mean that he was a brilliant actor? Or was this just the way he really was, without acting at all? I suspect that most Americans believed that Hudson, who seemed so natural on screen, was playing himself. Which means that in the summer of 1985, we had to accept the fact that many of our fundamental, conventional images of heterosexuality were instilled in us, and not for the first time, by a homosexual. Everything that happened on screen was a lie, with the real content embedded in code." End quote. Now, apparently, the assumption that everyone is heterosexual unless proven otherwise or proven ill blinded even theater critics to the workings of representation. Rich's statement makes it clear that Rock Hudson's public AIDS confession and death shocked some heterosexuals and those who speak for them. I suspect that most Americans, he says, speaking for them, shocked these people into a momentary awareness that heterosexuality can be convincingly performed by homosexuals, and that cinematic and media images of heterosexuality are indeed constructions. The eruption of this knowledge about Hudson's sexuality into the public consciousness led the media to drastic attempts at exonerating themselves from complicity in the construction of Hudson's closet. As Rich's case makes clear, it also led them to generate their own readings of Hudson's star image. These readings typically serve to reinforce some of the binary oppositions that structure what Eve Sedgwick famously termed the epistemology of the closet, namely in, out, homo, hetero, true, false, surface, depth. And one could probably find many, many more. Knowledge about Hudson's homosexuality, for instance, caused Rich to question the truth value of the cinematic image. Everything that happened on the screen was a lie, he says, and to apply a surface and depth model to the image as code hiding the real content, namely Hudson's homosexuality. Rich's comments are particularly forthcoming in their expression of an anxiety about the extent to which homosexual labor produces Hollywood's cinematic images. In contrast to Rich, and to most of his straight colleagues, gays and lesbians, I should say straight colleagues at the time, gays and lesbians have long-term first-hand experience with constraints on the representations of homosexuality, whether in Hollywood or in society at large. Producing and proliferating queer meanings, despite such constraints, has required us to make use of the traces, details, stylistic flourishes, and turns of phrase at our disposal. We expand and elaborate on these traces and details through such collective and often covert speculative practices as gossip, cruising, and gaydar. In his writing on camp and Hollywood film reception, film scholar Matthew Tinkham suggests that we play to the strengths of gossip and look back to Hollywood's classic cinematic images, neither as transparent windows onto the historical reality of homosexuality in the studio system, nor as code that need only be cracked in order to reveal the true content, the homosexual, behind it. Like the evidence of hearsay that gains its authority through circulation rather than through any inherent truth, the cinematic image should be viewed as something that takes on different meanings in the context within which it circulates. Wresting control of representation in the context of the AIDS epidemic meant, therefore, remaining attentive to and capitalizing on the multivalent meanings of images. Furthermore, it meant viewing images as sites of struggle over meanings and recognizing that the meanings that accrue to images are produced through debate and discussion, hence through circulation and elaboration. In order to produce queer meanings about Hudson's star image and about the images of others who labored in Hollywood during the McCarthyite, homophobic 50s, or even during a more recent, hardly homophilic time period, gays and lesbians, therefore, didn't need to wait until a star's public coming out. Thanks to the productive circulation of counter-public gossip, queers have often already circulated the speculations and generated the information and myths necessary to sustain fantasies about a star's sexuality long before a star makes a public issue of his or her sexual non-normativity. Hudson's coming out, therefore, made the queer resonances of his star images available to a wider public while recharging the currency of his image for a queer counterpublic. More significantly, however, this event functioned like many of the outings of stars, celebrities, and public figures that followed over the next decade. Namely, it highlighted the differences between modes and spheres of knowledge production around issues of sexuality. Douglas Crimp, for instance, has suggested that these outing campaigns, which tactically made public previously private subcultural speculations about political and entertainment figures, did not intend to expose the truth of a celebrity's sexual identity. Rather, they exposed the extent of the media's hypocritical and homophobic enforcement of standards of discretion with respect to sexuality. The gossip that was mobilized and codified by queer activists as outing challenged the status of the official media to regulate information about the private lives of public figures. In a discussion of Rock Hudson and Greta Garbo's star images, Judith Mayne, once again, situates the activist mobilization of gossip within the context of film spectatorship and argues that outing made evident the distinction between, quote, the public, relatively anonymous sphere of film going and the private knowledge of gays and lesbians, end quote. The public revelation of the history of queer counterpublic gossip in the form of outing made it impossible to ignore the fact that film spectators bring different experiences and knowledges about sexuality to bear on their film viewing. Hence, the scandal of outing, according to Mayne, was not its invasion of a star's or celebrity's privacy, but its destruction of the privacy of anonymous film viewing. Outing made inescapably evident the essential and reciprocal relationship between gossip and film spectatorship within queer culture. And now I'd like to turn to one, to my mind, significant queer video that makes evident the centrality of gossip about stars to the construction of queer identity and a queer counterpublic. And this time, the focus is not simply on movie stars, but about media personalities. And I guess I should say, I hope that even though I'm focusing in this work on stars and star images, that I hope that the kind of analytical tools that I'm trying to develop and refine in my thinking about stars can indeed be applied in other contexts. It just seemed particularly apt for my examples to focus on stars, but I think what I'm talking about has a certain kind of relevance to gossip in other contexts as well, and gossip about and of or other images. In the central section of videomaker Jean Carlamusto's L is for the Way You Look from 1991, a group of women discuss their special evening at a performance by lesbian comedian Reno at PS.122, an alternative performance space in New York City. As their story unfolds, we learn that the evening's entertainment derived less from the performance on stage than from the probable appearance in the audience of celebrities Fran Lebowitz and Dolly Parton. Et voilà. With each woman's account of this star sighting, or star sighting in quotes, the details are further transformed and embellished to the point that Dolly is reimagined as a butch dyke with a crew cut, making out with Fran. That is, as someone not unlike some of the lesbian gossipers themselves. And I'll show a clip now from the beginning of this section of Carlamusto's video. It's about 4 minutes, so a somewhat longer clip. It's not the best quality clip, so I apologize for that in advance. And I, in this context, should perhaps point out that the first person to speak is the artist Zoe Leonard. Could you start the clip, please? Oh, I think you linked it. Oh, great. Thank you. You could turn down the lights also. Thank you.
I had gone to see Reno, who I love, who I adore, and she was at PS.122, and I was sitting with my friends Simon and Nancy, and Reno was being great, as usual, and about maybe half or 3/4 of the way during the performance, at one point Nancy leaned over and she kind of like nudged me and she said, Fran Lebowitz is over there. And we're both, you know, we both kind of have a thing for Fran.
She was loving Reno. I was watching her, like, I got kind of obsessed with Fran. It's like more important for me to be seeing Fran laughing at Reno than Reno.
So she kind of pointed over and she said, well, I don't know if you can see her from where I'm sitting because of this column that was in the way. And I couldn't see Fran Lebowitz from where I was sitting, but I was aware that Fran was sitting near this column that I could see from where I was sitting.
We were going out, and suddenly there was this huge bottleneck. We couldn't move anywhere, and like, what's going on, You know, we just figured there was a crowd trying to get down the stairs. So we stopped along with everybody else, and then finally there was all this commotion. And I was in the back, and I couldn't see over everyone's heads, and I didn't know what was going on. And finally the crowd parted a little bit.
And all I see is this giant hair. It's like big, it was almost like it could have been like hair on a stick, just passing by. And this platinum huge thing on this little black, like, spandex.
Turn around, look who's over there. And I thought, oh, it's Fran Lebowitz, you know. Why is everyone getting so worked up about Fran? And I turned over, you know, and I turned and I looked. And I don't know, somehow what struck me, this is gonna sound so cliche, but I turned around and I just saw her breasts. I just saw this cleavage, and I saw this endowment. I saw and I was like, oh my God! And I looked and I saw the hair, and it was like it was Dolly Parton.
And she was just standing there in this wig, and I couldn't really see what she was wearing. But
well, she had this like little mini skirt that came down to about there, and this little top that was like showed her cleavage, and she was there with Fran Lebowitz, and she like
I
once
didn't see Fran.
She was there.
I was excited, and I thought, oh, don't stare, you know, give the woman privacy. Here she is, you know, on a little sojourn to the East Village. Don't, like, swarm her. And I was like, fuck it. This is Dolly. I'm going to stare. I love this woman.
And what kind of made me get more excited was that everyone else got so excited, and all of a sudden, like, Nancy came downstairs and she was like, did you see her, you know? And I was like, yeah, I mean, she was standing right next to me, you know?
All of a sudden, Zoe comes over because she sees I have, like, the better viewpoint than her.
And then Cynthia and Bea were there, and they'd kind of seen that me and Nancy had, like, sort of shamelessly found a spot to stand in where we would have an unobstructed view of Dolly.
I'm like, is that Dolly? Is that Dolly? And they're like, yes, it's her, it's her.
But she's right there, and then Fran Lebowitz comes. She had been, I don't know what she was doing, but that's who they were waiting for, and then they came, and I guess they left, and we were like, well, there they go, and then kind of looked at us like, let's follow them.
And Hillary was with us, and but we ran downstairs with Zoe and Simone.
Hillary Kipnis?
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah, we were going to tell you that. We all were walking down the stairs chanting, out of the closets and into the streets. And it was echoing like you wouldn't believe, because there was a group of us chanting it. And then Dolly was like right in front of us. So we were about right here when they finally got through that doorway. And so we kind of hurriedly went behind them out the door. So we continued to follow them down the street. And we went about halfway up the block, and at that point, I think they got into a taxi or a limousine.
We decided to milk this for all it was worth in terms of female bonding experience. So we all kind of like, we were all like telling each other, and we decided to do like a go-round.
And this section continues for almost another 10 minutes as the gossip gets passed on and transformed even more. Their gossip, based as it is on then current speculations about the lesbian sexuality of Dolly and Fran, is obviously less significant for the veracity of the information it circulates about the stars than for what it suggests about the women's desires and their creative imagination. For the purposes of their gossip, Dolly and Fran's mere appearance in a lesbian space provides the stuff, the details, out of which these women imaginatively build their queer world. This process of gossiping, of imaginatively constructing a queer world, also enables the intimacy that bonds the women together as lesbians. As Zoe, one of the gossipers, notes, we decided to milk this one for all it was worth in terms of a female bonding experience. Gossip about stars and celebrities is often funny, sometimes unexpected and tantalizing, usually about sex, sexuality, or non-normative social behavior, and always omnipresent in queer culture, at least in North American, European queer culture, in as much as I can even speak for that, which I can't, but I just did. As the example of the lesbian women gossiping about Dolly and Fran indicate, what to those on the outside may seem like so much ephemeral, indiscreet chatter can, for those on the inside, be used to generate an intense, if provisional, sense of intimacy, a female bonding experience. That such female bonding around the speculative comings and goings of others is possible should indicate to us that there is indeed something earnest and important in all this playful gossip, something that exceeds mere commentary on popular culture. Indeed, gossip is a self-reflexive commentary on the gossipers as well. As Crimp, once again, notes of Carla Musto's video, Dolly Parton may be the subject of the gossip, but the subjectivity represented in the video is that of the lesbians who gossip amongst themselves about Dolly. What matters is their visibility. Dolly is the absence around which a representation of lesbianism is constituted. But this is no simple structuralist lesson about representation founded on absence. Rather, it is meant to tell us something about the identifications we make and the communities we form through these identifications." End quote. Following Crimp, we could argue that queers don't simply gossip about celebrity and Hollywood star images. Through our gossip, we set such images, the identifications we make, on an indiscrete path of transformation. With our speculative practices, we embellish upon and transform the images that inspired the gossip in the first place. The images that we circulate, therefore, may no longer look the same as those that initially ignited the series. The signifiers of Dolly's feminine masquerade, her huge hair, her huge cleavage, her tiny spandex miniskirt, are transformed by the lesbian's gossip into the signifiers of butch masquerade. Unbelievable but true. For instance, one of the women's dish about Dolly is, "I heard she got a crew cut and wears wigs all the time." This is not simply a willful disinterest in accurate information, but a testament to gossip's emotional and affective investment in details already charged with gendered possibility. Gossip can therefore be a creative, imaginative production, a means of utilizing, transforming, and circulating details about others for their erotic and community-building potential. Thus, we can speak, I think, not simply of a gossip about images, but of a gossip of images. About gossip's generative political possibilities, Crimp once again writes, "The most fundamental need gossip has served for queers is that of the construction and reconstruction of our identities. Most of us can remember the first time we heard someone being called a queer or a fag or a dyke, and that someone not being ourselves, nevertheless responding within. So that's what I am." We painstakingly emerge from these self-derogations through new identifications, a process that often depends on gossip among ourselves. Really? He's gay? She's a dyke? Jody's a dyke? Then maybe I'm fabulous too. The Jody who Crimp refers to is, of course, Hollywood actress Jodie Foster, who in the late 1980s and early 90s was the object of queer activist outing campaigns. Earlier this year, as some of you may know, she kinda, sorta came out as a kinda, sorta lesbian at an awards show available on YouTube. I come now to my conclusion. By invoking gossip's formative role in the construction of queer identities, Crimp underscores the fundamental instability, or better, provisionality, of these very identities. For just as gossip about the sexuality of movie stars doesn't offer us a fixed truth about their sexual identity, so does our gossip about ourselves fail to securely fix the truth of our own identities. It really doesn't matter all that much to most of us if he, she, or Jody really is a dyke. The possibility that they might be suffices as confirmation that we might be as well. In taking on these speculations as descriptive of some aspect of ourselves, we test them against our own experiences and desires, and in the process, elaborate upon and transform them in the gossip we circulate. Then maybe I'm fabulous too. But what can we make of Crimp's shift from gossip and dyke to fabulous? Not that white monochromatic painting is fabulous, but it could be. Crimp doesn't write that in circulating speculations about the queer sexuality of others, we declare, then maybe I'm gay too, or then maybe I'm a dyke too. Instead, he suggests tentatively that maybe, just maybe, I'm fabulous too. I'd like to take Crimp's speculative speech act, "Maybe I'm fabulous too," as partially expressive of the function of gossip in the construction of queer identities and histories. In doing so, I am reading Crimp's shift from gay and dyke to fabulous as a shift from an empirically knowable sexual identity to a discursively constructed one. I actually should say I'm also thinking of the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze's writing on fabulation, on fabulation, a term he takes from Henri Bergson, which is a term Deleuze uses to most great effect and perhaps to his most explicit, if he ever does get explicit, political statement in his cinema books, in Cinema 2, where he describes fabulation as a process of storytelling, a narrative, a process of storytelling, of first-person storytelling. He describes in relation to political cinemas. And I, in my work on gossip, treat fabulation as the storytelling function of gossip. So we move from an empirically knowable sexual identity to a discursively constructed one. That is, by keeping knowledge about sexual practices and identities in discursive play. A particular queer kind of gossip solicits not the certainty of someone's sexual identity, their gay or lesbianness, but the fabulousness of its or any other possibility. Fabulous in a kind of colloquial sense, but also in relation to fable, myth, legends, these characters that one creates. Queer gossip seizes on details about Hollywood stars and media celebrities, mobilizes and transforms them, milks them for what they are worth in terms of a queer bonding experience. A gossip of images in queer film culture is both a chatty critique of Hollywood and a fabulous, speculative history of the secret lives of Hollywood images in queer counterpublics. Thank you.
Marc, thank you very much for your presentation. And I think, although it was located to a specific place, as you said, I do actually hope that it reverberates locally, because there is here a lot of gossip magazines in relation to all the stars and that come from the pop culture here. And that actually mixes with phantasmagoric superstition, just as a note, like in the week of Leslie Chung's death, many gossip magazines were gossiping if the ghost of Leslie had spoken to his boyfriend. No? So it comes to there. I just wanted to ask you...
It did.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you if, in the research that you're doing, especially with this film of Dolly Parton, like, is there something that you are also linking it to, like, class and rural and urbanity in America? Because, well, although Dolly is a star, she still represents a certain kind of America, which the other dyke to the right isn't somehow, no? It's like this, like, country is not exactly the cultural field of New England or the East Coast, no? So there's something that I feel that in the way that this, like, kind of like sophisticated camp dykes talk about this really stereotype pop, but not pop, but like country icon, no? If there is something that will relate to these two Americas that exist within the U.S.
No, it's thank you. Indeed, it's a really relevant thought. I don't focus too much in the book manuscript on gossip about Dolly, only in as much as it was relevant for this example. But I do draw attention to the importance of gossip as the kind of class function of gossip in shaping my theorization of it. And by that I mean the fact that the people who perhaps most frequently gossip, or for whom gossip is of great substantial importance to I think their sense of selves tend to be women, servants, or let's say, like in the broader sense of the term, people who are not in positions of power to use so-called official channels to circulate their information. And homosexuals fit into that. And so I draw on research that does look at gossip in some of these specific contexts. But you're perfectly right that Dolly, I mean, part of the kind of the details out of which one makes something of Dolly are her kind of rural, her accent, her the kind of signifiers of southern U.S. country living. And definitely, I think, I mean, we you know, the first thing I wanted to do when I came here was to do this Leslie tourism, and I do think that there's certainly, I think, relevance to think. I think one would maybe have to refine or alter or throw away some of my theorizing of gossip in relation to the context I'm discussing in order to get at some of the specificities here in relation to gossip around Leslie and the meanings that might mean in Hong Kong or in mainland or Taiwan, but for instance, but I think that there are certainly a lot of crossover. There is a lot of crossover.
Thank you for that, Marc. That was great. And one of the things that it's left me just thinking about is around the connection of gossip to myth, mm-hmm. and sort of the temporality in which it plays, and then how that kind of myth making comes out of little gossips, and also to connect it to one of our earlier talks. This may seem like a wild connection, but to David Tay and looking at Thailand. And one of the things that...
Thailand, yeah.
Thailand, yeah. So looking at, the myth of Thailand never been conquered, never been colonized, uh-huh. and these little sort of things that come in, is that not too a type of gossip? Mm-hmm. And how does that play with time and sort of subject area? I'm sorry, it's not a very clear question, mm-hmm. but it's just a sort of pondering that I'd love to mm-hmm. hear your thoughts on.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you so much. I cut out, as I was listening to a number of the other talks, I was making all these notes because I felt that perhaps my discussion, not only of a North American context, but also of Hollywood stars, might seem so far afield in the context of the discussions that we've heard, the wonderful discussions we've heard so far, and so I was making notes along the side that move in that direction. I was thinking in relation to Yang Yang's discussion of the ethos within community formation in activist groups is one thing, but I think also, and of course with Petra's discussion of Soulful Black Sisters, I do think that's why I got interested, I have to say, in Deleuze's note, the way Deleuze takes from Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, the notion of fabulation or fabulation, which in Bergson is a faculty of the mind, and it's the faculty of the mind that kind of checks intelligence by generating mythical figures. It's the faculty of the mind that moves into faith, to questions of faith, to religion, to fantasy, fiction. And Deleuze takes that and lends it a specifically political value, to think of it in relation to the role in, for instance, direct cinema or cinema verite films, in which we have people speaking in the first person, but that first person that they're speaking in does not necessarily seem solely to belong to them, but indeed seems to be a first person that one is creating through speaking, through narrating the self. And that process of narration then is a process of generating this kind of mythical I that then perhaps in being in cinema, in being told to an audience, can indeed then circulate and be taken on by others to be transformed as well. And so I think that's one thought in relation to myths. I think to think of gossip as a situated knowledge that can particularly challenge the lines of dividing lines between public and private, official and unofficial, and true and false. I think it's quite relevant to think of that in relation to myths about nation, about state as well. And if I may indulge you just one last thought about time and temporality, I think also with gossip, one of the things that I'm fascinated about, particularly in relation to linking gossip to cinema, is a question of temporality and thinking of the time of gossip, the temporality of speculation, and indeed the sense that one takes something from the past, a spoken, a heard from the past, the rabbit ears that hear, and take something from the past and circulate that and elaborate upon that in a present with others in order to generate, I think, not simply a reflection on the past, but indeed a reflection on the future, let's say, in the sense of generating images and imaginative possibilities that can and often are intended for the ears of others to come. As one knows, when the greatest way to spread gossip is to say, don't tell anyone you heard this from me. And indeed, then it goes on. So I think that's maybe another avenue of connection with other things. Thank you.